Good evening, everybody. Glad to have so many people here uh, to study tonight, and I hope that everything I've brought will be for our benefit and our education. I'd like to start with a bit of oversharing, if that's okay. Um, my I don't know my biological father very well. My parents divorced when I was 13, and just that relationship did not continue. In college, I was like, I've had enough. Anyway, so he and I have not really spoken to any real degree since I was 18. And he makes it a point to call or to let me know that he's found me. And so it always stops at that. It's just a notification. Just gonna drop this in your lap, Christmas card, whatever it may be. Anyway, all this unsettling bit to then say, so this past weekend, past week, he called me to say, uh, I found you at church because you've got all these things recorded and all of these, uh, all these lessons that are, being posted on the website. And at first it was a little unnerving, but then I thought better of it. And I thought of all the places for him to find me, it wasn't social media, it wasn't a bar, it wasn't anywhere else other than church. And Lord willing, maybe he'll start watching. Maybe he'll find that chance to get back into God's good graces. And I hope that for him. And if he watches this, maybe that's a plug for that. Anyway, just a curiosity. Anyway, so we're going to study, as the title would suggest, Philippians. Some of you all are getting PTSD because we studied it earlier this year. And the rest of you are like, well, hey, let's have a refresher. Why not? See how much he repeats himself. So we're going to study we're going to study, four main things, three of which are takeaways I'd like for us to have. Paul's situation at the time of writing the letter and how he views that moment, his response to others, and then the call for unity. So we'll hopefully have the time to talk about all of these above. So we'll start with the history. The letter, which I forgot to include earlier in this, or when I was making these slides, the letter was written 61 to 63 AD. Depending on who you're kind of studying from. And that entirely depends, that 2-year gap is all about where the scholar feels Paul is in his time of captivity. As he's a political prisoner, where he is and where he probably wrote it at that point. So just to give you kind of a ballpark timeline. Now to talk about the city itself, Philippi. Formerly, it was Crenides of Thrace, settled in 360 BC, 300 years before this, 420 years before this. Conquered by King Philip of Macedon, King Philip then renames it Philippi, not lacking for imagination. And the city really begins to grow at this point. They discover gold nearby next to this swamp, and it turns out to be a very rich vein that they continue to mine for over a century. That gold then needs to be, protected. So there's a fort put in place and, fortifications to make sure that no one can get to it. And eventually a mint. So take the gold, take it straight over for processing. So this is a very wealthy spot. This is a very traveled spot because it is a site of wealth and where wealth gets literally made. But it also connects all of Greece. It's a kind of a highway across, and becomes a highway of sorts. It becomes part of Via Ignatia, and it's a road that is maintained for over a millennium. So it's a very important established city at the time when Paul is writing to this church, and more importantly, when he establishes the church. It was something. Anyway, yes. So to continue the history of Philippi, the the Romans, we really don't know what happens beyond a certain point. Once we get to that point of the mint being formed, it kind of drops off the face of the map, but or the face of the earth. But the Romans come in and destroy it during the sacking of Macedon in 168 BC. So a decent amount of time passes. Oh, no, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Rome destroys it. And then in 42 BC, after Julius Caesar is stabbed, Mark Antony and Longinus, they then start defeating Brutus's forces, and this is finally when it kind of picks back up, and we now know where it is in terms of the history. After Octavius and after Octavian and Mark Antony win against Brutus and Longinus, it then becomes Philippi, and it's given a Latinized name that I won't bore you with. But now it needs to be populated. So Octavian and Mark Antony send the 23rd Legion to go. It says, congratulations on all your fine work. You are now retired, and go settle this for us if you don't mind. So this land, still has the very high walls. It still has a lot of the Greek features, even though it was destroyed. Things like the theater are still there. And they go in and they centuriate it. They break it up into smaller pieces and then give the land out, or give the land out to the soldiers. They build in a forum to have a space for public events and information. And as I mentioned, they have a Greek theater. They basically model themselves to be a miniaturized Rome, and they really take a lot of pride in that fact. They follow themselves like a regiment. It's a bunch of soldiers. They go and they model themselves after Rome and the soldier, mentality that they all have and share. So Latin and Greek would have been the dominant languages, but given that this is a very well-traveled place, because it connects Rome with all of the East, there's a lot of other languages that come in. So this is a metropolis, as good of a sense of the word as can be at this point in history. I give you all of this information because I think it helps set the stage. It takes it from being this place where a church was, and really says this was a fleshed out place where people lived and what was here. So anyway, now let's talk about the church. We read about the founding of the church in Acts. In Acts 16, verses 10 through 15. And if you'll turn in your Bibles there. Acts 16, verses 10 through 15. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us for to preach the gospel unto them. Therefore, loosing from Troas, we came with a straight course to Samothracia, and the next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony, and we were in that city abiding certain days. And on the Sabbath we went out of the city by the riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshiped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized, and her household, she besought us, saying, if ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and abide there. And she constrained us. So this is kind of really the start of that church. Lydia is out at the side of the river because at this point, Rome has decided Jews cannot be trusted to be inside the city walls. They're too cloistered. They're too self-interested to be trusted to serve Rome. So they issued this ordinance that said that all Jews had to be outside of the city. And Philippi, not one to be left out, does the exact same thing. And so we see Lydia and a group of women outside wanting to say prayers. Now, that wanting to say prayers can kind of give us an inkling as to how many people there are at the time of this, because you were allowed to start building something if you had, like, I think it was something like 15 people. So this is a small group. Anyway, so Lydia is quickly converted. She's a wealthy woman, given that she's a seller of purple. And she then constrains them to stay with her for a while. And then we get into the rest of Acts, verses 16 through the end of the chapter, verse 40. And what a ride it is. I mean, this is truly a phenomenal chapter of Acts. Paul and Silas are thrown into prison because this woman is following behind them like a can at the end of a dog's tail, just making all this ruckus. You know, these are the men that worship the Lord. And Paul, not having this, casts the spirit of divination out of her, and these men of some wealth realize that they have lost their prize, someone who had that spirit of divination, and then they rally up the town and say, let's get these guys. And they do. The magistrates, constrain Paul and Silas and then throw them into prison, where we then see one of the best stories of conversion. We see as they're thrown into the center of the prison, the word there for prison indicates that it was the innermost part of what's essentially a prison of concentric rings. The further in you go, the more secure it is, and that you have to get through the other layers to get out. But they're singing praises well into the night, and then a great earthquake comes, and everyone is still there, and the Philippian jailer, who hasn't even bothered to look yet, goes to kill himself. And we're familiar with the Philippian jailer, but anyway, the Philippian jailer and all of his house are then baptized and added to the Lord and to that church. So after this, the magistrates the next day have kind of cooled off, realized that this probably wasn't the way to do this. But Paul isn't going to be quietly shuffled out of the city like, oh, hey, we're sorry. Paul then reminds them, I am a Roman. And that's bad for them because they've ignored the rule of law, which they tout so highly. They have also taken a Roman citizen without fair trial and imprisoned him. And Paul is not going to just quietly give them what they're after. He's going to let them know, you have messed up. And if it's known to Rome that Philippi is making these kinds of choices, there could be some major repercussions. People could get, executed or reassigned. Anyway, all of this to lay the foundation of that church. And what a truly phenomenal church. A group of people who would not have probably come together any other way, thrust in, baptized, believing, having seen the marvelous works of Christ and not of Paul and Silas, and this was probably, and being in such a wealthy town, this is probably a very well-off church, because we read more about it in Philippians, but is also one that probably felt very emboldened because of everything that had happened surrounding Paul's visit. So let's see. After that, Lydia, they go back to visit Lydia, they provide encouragement, and they go on their way. So with all that, now let's actually talk about Philippians. So the first major theme I'd like to cover is Paul's situation and his assessment of his situation. Paul at this point is a political prisoner. Shortly after this, in Acts 21, Paul is performing this kind of public act of contrition because there have been accusations and they're not founded, but Paul is not going to let this be a stumbling block that keeps others from hearing his word. So he starts going to the synagogue daily to be seen, to show this public act of contrition. And it's on these trips that he's then spotted. And they're like, let's get him. The Jewish people that stand so firmly against Christianity are like, let's get him. So these people then work the city into a frenzy, say that they make false accusations of their own, that Paul had brought a Gentile into the synagogue. And so they rally everyone. And this eventually requires the chief captain to go in and see what's going on, and to squash it, because Rome now occupies Jerusalem, and he's got to keep it under control. He can't just let it run amok on its own. So he speaks to he takes Paul into his custody, speaks to the people, and Paul, ever undaunted and incredibly capable, then says, let me speak to them. I would be glad to talk to them. So in Acts 23, he goes up, speaks to the crowd in their own language, to then say, I'm not meaning any harm. I'm here to just do this. And by the way, let me tell you about my conversion to Christianity. Never one to let a chance to evangelize get in the way of anything else, or never letting anything else get in the way of a good evangelistic preaching. He gives them his journey, and it does not really improve anything. The crowd does not suddenly become calm. So he stays in custody. Great. I have left this guy's name off. Anyway, he stays a political prisoner and continues to have to escalate his trial by saying, I want to go speak to the next person up the chain, kind of like how we appeal to lower courts, then to higher courts, and then eventually the Supreme Court. So he becomes a political prisoner, always in trouble because of his faith in Christ, not because of anything he's actually done. And he is kind of a curiosity. Felix keeps him for 2 years on the auspices of wanting, kind of as a curiosity to see what he's preaching and what he's embodying, but also because, he's got to wait for him to get in court. Anyway, Paul is still a political prisoner at the writing of this, and it's in part of this letter, although you almost couldn't tell it. So Paul starts this letter with all of the salutations and greetings, and buries the lead by eventually getting to verses 9 through 12, where he eventually says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident of the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So I imagine this church, pouring through this letter to try to find how Paul is doing. You can't just go Google how's Paul doing and how's his court case back then, but it's not in here. And this is important, and I want to stay here for this. In this letter, we don't learn about his trial, his status within it. Paul is still very much in limbo, and he wrestles with this all throughout the letter. It could just simply be because he's under house arrest and his correspondence is monitored in case he says, hey, come spring me out on this day at this time with these people. It could be that. It could also be that Paul doesn't care, and he's fine with whatever the course may be. And I think, and I'm going to assert for this class today, that it's that the latter is the true case here. Regardless of whether part A is true, part B is more the point. This trial has let Paul speak to so many people, and unconcerned with his own hell, or unconcerned with his own life, unconcerned with anything, he has talked to the entire Praetorian Guard. This is about 90 people. Actually, scratch that, 900 people. So he's let almost 1,000 Praetorian guards know, because they were broken into predictable units of people. But that, and all the rest that follows the Praetorian Guard, that imperial guard, is also interesting, because in Roman high society, there would have been attendants, courtiers, officers, guards, maybe even the public as well. Paul is such a poster child for continuing to talk about God through any adversity that I really think that's worth drawing out today in our lesson. He is unconcerned with himself. The more concerning thing is God, God's glory, and that everyone gets to hear it. And I think that's just staggering. So the one thing, so if there's anything I want you to take away from today, it's that we could learn a lot from Paul in this very short passage. We go throughout our lives, concerned that someone may not like what we have to say, or this may not seem like the right occasion to bring this up, or this person may not want to hear it. Paul shows us right here that even in situations none of us would ever want to be in, much less are in, a literal life or death situation for Paul, he will make sure that everybody hears it. And I think that if we can even do a fraction of that and let one person know, two people know, that is to God's glory. And that also speaks to the fact that we believe and we follow the cause of Christ. So put a big mental asterisk next to this one. We need to follow Paul's example and talk about Christ everywhere. It needs to be the constant thing, ever ready. They need to know about us and know before we even clear our throat to get started what we're about to talk to them about. I think that would be an admirable thing for any of us, even to a modest degree. And while Paul is a great example of that, it gets better, honestly, because in this passage, skipping down a few verses, Paul says, "And I rejoice, for I know," I'm skipping ahead mentally. But Paul is going to rejoice about this. He is undaunted, and he sees this as a win-win situation. And what allows him to do this is a discarding of self and this alignment of purpose to God. And that's not something you come about easily, and it's something I imagine has to be maintained with a lot of effort. Okay, we're good. Okay. So second thing I'd like to discuss is Paul's response to others, because we see again a great example of who we should be as we work with others. So in chapter 1 and verse 15, we read that Paul is telling us that there are some who are preaching Christ out of envy and but some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Paul being a high-profile case, this Jew turned Christian that's taking the Greek world or the Roman world by storm. This is a high-profile case, and it has a lot of attention. And thanks to Paul, this is causing a lot of interest in the world, and all of these Christians are having this opportunity to begin conversations and saying, "Oh yeah, let me tell you what Paul's teaching, or let me show you what I believe." And some of them are doing out of goodwill, which is what we would all hope. But there are some who are going and doing this because they kind of want to get at Paul. They're doing it to spite him, to out of a rivalry. I'll be just as good as you. I'm sure it was I'd like to think maybe somebody got close, but I doubt it. Anyway, imagine that. Imagine someone else just takes grievance with you personally and then says, I'm going to baptize more people than you. I'm going to show you that you're not nearly as good as me at conversion. Paul could take this disparagingly. He could let it bother him. I mean, it's an attack against him and what he stands for. But Paul's alignment with God and his focus on making sure that that Christ is being glorified sees this as yet another win. The eternal optimist over here sees these people and is like, well, if Christ is getting glorified, what do I matter? He himself is removed from this, and God is the focus. And I think that that's amazing. To be able to take yourself out of the equation and go, but is God being glorified? If so, we don't have a problem here. Just amazing. And I hope I'm conveying, I hope maybe you agree. I'm hoping you agree. But Paul puts God first, God and Christ first. He has that alignment. He's unaffected by that chaos and uncertainty, the danger that he himself is in, and the motivations of others as they preach Christ. He sees this with such incredible simplicity that he's good with it, completely unaffected. And I think that's a great takeaway for us today, that as we go throughout life and the little things start to get at us, there's all those little frustrations, we can say, but is God being glorified? Or, am I putting myself in the center and I've lost sight of what's at the true core of God's glory? So we can view almost, we can look at almost any situation and find the blessing if we choose to find it, or if we choose to take ourselves out of that equation. And I imagine that I would love to think that one of the Romans there in the city who has this rivalry with Paul, I hope that somebody got to read this next one. Yes, and I will rejoice. Oh, I imagine that boiled somebody up. He's happy about it. He's happy about our imagined rivalry. He's good with it. Oh, he's good. He wants to know that, and as he's fine with it, he then says, I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit that I'll be delivered from where I'm at, and that I'll get to join you shortly. I'll get out of this and we'll go on and we'll do great things together. It's just amazing. I have a note here and I didn't get to work it in, but I imagine someone foaming at the mouth over that. I will rejoice over this, over these people. But this isn't to say that everything's totally okay. There is a line at which Paul then takes grievance. And we see it later on in chapter 3. In chapter 3, we see when Paul does get upset about the motivations of other people. And that's when they start perverting the word of the Lord. In chapter 3, verses 2 through 4, he warns the church to watch out for dogs seeking to mutilate the flesh and pushing circumcision. So not everything is permissible for Paul. These Judaizers that are Christians who are either Christians or who are Jews first, then Christians, or Christians who have kind of gone back to what's comfortable being Jewish. Not sure as to which, or it could be both. It doesn't have to be the exclusion of the other. But these Judaizers are trying to push the need to be physically circumcised to then say, now you are actually good. And this, Paul would then call Jews dogs. Now, The Jews liked to use this term to refer to Gentiles. We're not talking about a Pekingese. We're not talking about a corgi. We're talking about wild dogs, scavengers. We're talking about a nuisance, a public nuisance, and for carriers of disease as well. We're not talking about domesticated dogs. We're talking about wild dogs. And Jews used this term as a derogatory way to talk about Gentiles. Now, Paul would take that very same term that they're so used to and use it on them. These unclean creatures that are coming in seeking to pervert everything. That at that point, Paul is troubled. Paul's upset about this because of what they're trying to do. They're trying to push the old law as justification for the new. They're ignoring the plan of salvation that has been brought to them. But they're also doing two more things that I want to draw out, which is they're saying that something that is a physical representation supersedes or makes complete a spiritual choice, and that something that you can personally do can outweigh something, or it can complement something that God has put into place. So while I don't think anybody here has had someone come up to them today and be like, look, snip, snip. No, I don't think anyone's doing that today, but that spirit of coming in and saying, this needs to happen before you can really do this. That kind of legalistic type of, well, this has to happen and then that before this. That kind of cobbling together of some extra things. The Bible is open to no private interpretation. So we need to watch out for people that would come in and start trying to drive a wedge between us and Christ, or start saying, well, there's this extra thing you need to do in order to be really acceptable. So that's probably what we need to think of today when we hear this kind of passage of, has anyone been talking to us? Because as we talked about this past Sunday, I imagine a lot of these types of things happen in private settings where they can pick off people one-on-one and say, let me teach you this additional thing, and bring in something that wasn't true. So we then see in this passage, 17 through 21, what the fate is of both parties, those that follow and those that don't. Verse 17, brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. For many, who I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is in their belly, and they glory in their shame with their mind set on earthly things. But our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who will transform our lowly body to be like his glorious body by the power that enables him even to subject all things to himself. And I don't think anybody here has a question as to which camp they'd rather be in, the one of destruction or the one where we are subject to Christ. The third thing and final thing that we'll talk about before we dismiss is unity. Unity is called for in almost every letter of Paul, as we've seen throughout this marvelous summer series. Paul is emphatic that we need to be unified, that we be of one mind, and we'll look at that list in the next slide. But if Paul is telling us that it is important to be unified, is it important if he says it multiple times? If it's reiterated all over the Bible, is it something that's probably hard to obtain? Probably. if it's something that is reiterated all over the Bible, is it something that only a couple people have to obtain, the church that's, the object of the letter? No, it's probably something every single church, every single person needs to achieve. So this is for you. This is for each and every one of us in ever-growing concentric circles, going from our individual selves to our family to larger group to the entirety. We need to strive for unity because it's essential to success. So Paul gives a bit of a laundry list of different things. And rather than including it in a big wall of text, I thought, let's put it in bullet points and let's have these kind of broken out for us to chew individually. Be of the same mind. It's difficult because we like our own thoughts. We love our thoughts. Our thoughts are very, very fun to listen to. I can't go to sleep sometimes because I'm laying there in bed going, I hate this thought. I hate everything about it, and I'm stuck with it. But we all have those times where we're just addicted to something that we're thinking about. We need to get past that, and we need to get to the point where we can be of the same mind. We need to be working towards things together. We need to be working, we need to figure out what we need to be doing. We do that through effective search of the scriptures, through the continuous study and the application of it. So it's a monumental task, but it's absolutely essential for us to do. Be of the same love. Now, we're not talking about love like Charlie's really great love for chili. I don't have to love chili the same way Charlie does. Now I do. We both really enjoy chili quite a bit, but we don't have to bond over that per se. But what we do bond over is the love of Christ. We bond over the love of the Lord and the service therein. Sorry for calling you out. I just thought we'd share a joke anyway, at your expense, maybe. Okay. Be in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit. Here we go from these individual mandates and these things that we should do to the things that we shouldn't. Doing nothing out of selfishness, which is that disunity. It's this is for me. It's for, me or a small group here. Out of conceit, out of our own glorying, do things out of humility. And humility is something that is very uniquely Christian. As civilizations have come up, whether or not they believed in the Lord, there are certain things that people have kind of all agreed this is good, or this is something that is beneficial. But humility is a very Christian and a very godly virtue, because what humility does is it says that we are not as important as all of the people around us. We esteem others as higher than ourselves, and we serve others from that aspect. It's a lot easier to do something for someone that you find to be even more important or even better or whatever, superlative you want to give it than you. It's a lot easier to do something for someone else when you put them on a pedestal. And we do that because Paul reminds us here in this letter that Christ made himself lower to serve us. We are certainly not at the level of Christ at all, but he would put himself in subjection, put himself in an earthly form to live a perfect life, to be sacrificed for us so that he could serve us. We did nothing to deserve that, but he would do that for us. And Paul tells us that we need to be like that. We need to be like Christ in that service aspect, in that humility. And that is a very, very distinct value of Christianity, that we are humble to everyone else because it is an echo. It is a way that we can emulate God and Christ. So that humility is important because it then makes the other things, the unity, the service, all of the other things, not doing things out of selfishness, a lot easier. Be a servant, obey God, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Shine as lights in the world. There's plenty of things here for you, and you could make it an action plan, or you could do whatever you want with these. There's something to work on here, and there's a spot to be polished, no matter who you are. I'm sure Paul would have said I could do A, B, C, or whatever, and we'd all go, "What? Why?" But he would still probably agree that he had something he could work on, just like we do. Um, and we see that kind of service to others all throughout the Bible, all throughout the New Testament. In Acts 2, verses 44 through 45, we see that the church worked to make sure that nobody lacked for want. They sold their possessions and they made sure no one needed for anything. We just did something similar this past Sunday. Oscar and Gabriel have moved into an apartment, and a whole cavalcade of people came together and said, "Here's stuff, help." Like they came together when there was a need and did that. And I'm sure that there will be future opportunities, because this church is very good at that, in my opinion, about coming together the second there's a need. I mentioned that the clothing closet at UK needed clothes, and because if a patient's brought in and they need to get to something like a gunshot wound or some kind of a wound, they will cut the clothes away rather than try to shimmy the pants off or whatever. So then they wake up and they're like, "Oh yeah, wear this surgery gown or whatever." I mentioned it once here to the congregation, and I filled my truck bed with clothes. They were like, "How many more loads do you have?" And I still had two. They were floored by how much we had given on one mention. And I say that to congratulate this group on that. Acts 6, we see that the widows, it became aware that some of the widows weren't being taken care of. And we see people assigned to the task. So are we caring for all of our widows? Is there someone who is needing something right now that we can do that for? These are things that we can be asking as we pursue that unity and as we try to take care of everyone in this congregation. So, yeah, we did get, yeah, I'll call it there. Thank you all for your time, and you'll see me in 5 more minutes.